Hello AS, welcome to Cognitive Psychology. So we're going to look at the cognitive approach. This links very closely with memory that you have looked at with Andy, and it's just extending it, that knowledge that little bit further. And I have tried to include reference to Andy's stuff as much as possible to keep the amount of new information you need to remember as small as possible. Please make sure you make full notes on this, including, absolutely vitally, in lots of detail, the evaluation points, because you do need to be checking these. This might be your only record of those evaluation points. So there are several key terms we're going to go through: internal mental processes, schema, inference or inferences, theoretical models, computational computer models, the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. Now all of these terms sound a bit scary, but actually most of them are fairly easy ones, concepts that you've come across before. Internal mental processing, which we'll just keep on the board on the video here for a minute. Internal mental processing sounds very, very fancy. Internal, inside, mental, in your mind, processing. So it essentially means any thought process that you go through at all. So it involves attention, perception, so how we perceive the world, as in visually how we perceive it and understand it, problem solving, memory, anything that happens in our mind. Psychologists call it the little black box. Behavioural psychologists move away from this because they believe we should only look at observable behaviours, such as ringing a tuning fork and seeing if the dog responds to that, whereas cognitive psychologists are all about internal mental processes, the little black box, the mind that we cannot directly observe, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So it's really important to be aware we cannot directly observe the mind. Internal mental processes, you've come across these before in the role of mediational process. So I said before, social learning theory is the bridge from behaviourist approach, which just says it's external, observable behaviours and external stimulus that control our behaviour, to cognitive psychologists who say that the only thing that we should look at is internal mental processes, so our thought processes, and they control our behaviour. Social learning theory is a mixture of the two. They say there are some external influences, such as observation and imitation, and also some internal mental thought processes in the role of mediational process. So there we go. Whenever you hear the word thought process, I want you to say internal mental processes. The same with cognition. If you ever heard me or anyone say mention cognition, it just means the way they think, the way they process things in their mind. Now schema, and you've got a definition there from the Mark scheme, are a pattern of thought or behaviour that categorises information, organises categories of information and the relationships among them. You will look at this closely in cognitive development with Andy in the second year, but all it means is our brain is essentially organised into little different mind maps, different schemas, kind of little categories that, or organisational folders that organise our minds. So a really good way to think of a schema is like documents in of folders in a computer. So the mind is always filtering information down. So first of all, you're in college, so you'd open your college folder. Then you'd be in psychology, so you'd open your psychology folder. Then you'd be in your Harriet's lessons, so you'd open your Harriet's folder. Then you'd be in the approaches, so you open the approaches folder. Then you know that you're looking at cognitive psychology, so you open the cognitive folder, and all the information is there. So if I asked you a question in class, you would filter through that process in your brain, in your mind, and this is a theoretical model, so it's something that doesn't physically exist. If I cut you open, I wouldn't be able to see different schemas in your brain, but it's a representation of the way we structure thoughts and memories and information in our mind. And we've got one here, and I am going to ask you to create one in class. We've got the word egg, and look at all the different possible things that it could mean. So bird, it makes you think of bird, feathered, winged, warm-blooded, and then eggs, different sizes: turtle egg, ostrich egg, quail egg. So quail eggs are tiny, ostrich eggs are huge, different colours, there's white eggs, blue eggs, and so on. So there's loads and loads of different kind of ways of categorising it, where you'd find it in the supermarket. So all your information about eggs and anything in fact is structured in this way. That is why mind maps are recommended as such an effective thing. They are related to schema, so they are related to the idea that our minds are structured in this way. We also have schema for how we should behave. So for example, we have categories. So as I mentioned, college, well, you have in your college folder, you have how you should behave in class and how you might behave outside of class, how you behave in the diner, how you behave in the atrium. So in class, for example, you wouldn't eat, whereas in the diner you know that you should be eating. That's generally where you'd sit to do that. In the library, you know it's silent study. In the green area, you know there should be only quiet discussion, which is hopefully how you approach your study in the green area. If you were, it's the idea that if you were beamed down, or the reason that we can see a still picture and we can say, oh yeah, this is probably happening. So if I showed you an image of something, you'd be able to access all your schema to kind of work that out. So if I showed you a picture of a classroom, you'd think, right, the tables are grouped together. There are lots of people sitting down. There are about 16 to 18-year-olds, so not fairly young-ish. So they must probably in a college because there's no school uniform. They're wearing lanyards. If you have a look around, there's lots of posters on the wall. So already you're starting to access your schema to work out what situation you are in, your understanding of a situation, and also then how to behave in that situation. So you can access all of that. So there's schema, which we will have another look at in class, but do make sure you're comfortable a little and have a look for a couple of other definitions of it as well, because whilst that one is off the mark scheme, there are better ways to explain it. The next term is the idea of inference. So going beyond the immediate evidence to make assumptions about mental processes that cannot be directly observed. That's off the mark scheme, the exact definition of what inference is, and it has been asked previously and it's panicked people a little bit. Basically, it means making logical guesses and assumptions based on what we can observe. And we can't directly observe things. So, for example, we cannot cut someone open and directly observe exactly how memory works, or exactly how them paying attention works, or how perception works, exactly the psychological elements of that, but we can make assumptions based on things that happen. For example, and I'm going to take it away from psychology for a moment just to give you some ideas, the lights aren't on in the house. We assume that no one is at home. We can't directly look inside the house and see that there's nobody at home, but because the lights aren't on, we can assume that nobody is in the house, especially if it's at night. We've got a toddler is upstairs in bed. She hears a bang and crying. Sherry infers that her toddler fell out of bed. She hasn't directly observed it. She couldn't see it happen. She's not got CCTV footage in her toddler's bedroom, but she hears a bang, she goes upstairs, and the toddler is on the floor. She didn't see the process happen, but she can assume from the information that she's got. Same with John hearing a smoke alarm and smelling burnt bacon. John can infer that his neighbour has burnt his breakfast, especially if it's 8:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning. John hasn't directly seen his neighbour burn his breakfast, but because of the information, the smell of burnt bacon, the alarm going off, and the fact it's 9 o'clock in the morning or 8:30 in the morning, he can make a good assumption it's probably his breakfast he's burnt. Norman sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. Norman can infer this son got into the cookie jar. So he didn't see the son get into the cookie jar, he didn't see the son eat the cookies, but because of the cookie crumbs and the chocolate is around his mouth, he can assume that that's what's happened. And the final one, the floor is covered in shreds of newspaper and Susan's dog has newspaper on his paws. We can infer, we can assume, we can work out. We didn't see Susan's dog do it, but from the evidence we can assume that Susan's dog ate the newspaper. Okay, so I want you to have a think about those terms and how they could be applied to psychology. For example, we can't observe problem solving or memory. Memory is a better one actually. We can't observe memory happening directly. However, we can test, thinking about the context dependent learning, so we can test we can get people to learn a list of words underwater, and then we can test them above water and below water and see which they recall better. Now that isn't a direct observation of how the little black box works. We're not cracking somebody's head open, looking in memory, seeing how it works, but because we see that someone remembers more words on one list than the other, we can we can assume that memory is improved by remembering things in the context that they are in. The same with, for example, Clive Waring. I think it was, he tested my memory a bit, I haven't taught memory for a while. Clive Waring, who couldn't transfer information from his short term to his long term, so we can't look into his mind and see exactly that break between the short term and the long term memory, but we can observe him, and if he keeps forgetting information between 15 and 30 seconds after it's been shared with him, we can infer, we can assume that there is damage between the short term and the long term memory. Theoretical models are theories that represent the cognitive and thought processes that happen in the brain, but they aren't physical representations of it. So for example, we've got the ABC model, the idea, and if you can have a read of this information in your book, it is something you need to know for psychopathology that I'd like you to start to get comfortable with now, so you can use it in cognitive and also extend it. For example, the ABC model, activating event, belief and consequences. So this is where we develop this is a way of explaining irrational thought processes. Now, irrational, obviously, in everyday life isn't a very nice term to use in psychological terms. It means any thought process that makes us unhappy. So an irrational thought process is a thought process that interferes with our life and makes us unhappy. So, for example, an activating event might be, the irrational belief is what we hold, so is the B. So there'd be an activating event such as being sacked. The irrational belief would be, I'm no good, no one will ever want to hire me again, I'm just going to die penniless and alone, and no one will ever love me. And the consequence is, because of that, you don't go out and you don't seek work. Okay, so that's where we look at. So the ABC model, if I cracked somebody's head open and looked inside, I wouldn't see a section for A, a section for B and a section for C. That's why it's theoretical. It represents a process, not a physical structure. The same with the long-term and short-term memory. If I crack somebody's head open, the multistore model, I wouldn't see a little blob of brain for sensory memory, for short-term memory and long-term memory, and arrows pointing at them in a little loop for rehearsal. It's merely a way of representing how memory works. So it's a theoretical representation rather than a physical representation of something, because obviously in biology or in other subjects you would get an image that physically represents, so a diagram of the brain which exactly represents what the brain looks like. Computational models are models based on computers. The biggest belief of cognitive psychologists, and it's developed around the 60s, was the fact that the human brain processes information like a computer. So we compare humans to computers, and I want you to think about that for evaluational purposes. So, and those you can see, we've got the short-term memory. So we've got environmental input, we've got retrieval and rehearsal. So if you have a look at all of these terms, they are all very closely related. If you recognise those terms from when you've looked at them in Andy with the multi-store model, you can see them you can see some of the terminology, the crossover between humans and computers. You've got encoding, coding, input, output, process, storage, retrieval, and they're all terms we use interchangeably in the cognitive approach between humans and computers. And I've got an image there you can see. So you've got the input is the mouse, you've got processing, and you've got output and storage, and we talk about stores of memory. Input being information that's inputted, then you process it, send it to a short-term or a long-term store, and then at output you recall that information. So it's like a computational model. And finally, we have the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive, internal mental processes, the way we think; neuro, the brain; science, not quite direct translation, but the study of, essentially. So we are studying internal thought processes, internal mental processes, so cognitive processes, and where they happen physically within the brain. And this is when you've looked at things like Squires and Beardsley, I think they're the names, and different parts of the brain fit with different parts of short-term and long-term memory. So it says a branch of cognitive psychology which focuses on the structure of the brain and its impact on cognition. So how is the brain structured? Where do the cognitive processes happen? The emergence of cognitive neuroscience. Before brain scanning technology, psychologists looked at brain damaged patients and conducted autopsies. A better word for that, because it's on the A2 mark scheme, is a post-mortem. So before brain scanning technology, scanning technology was the revolutionary thing that revolutionised cognitive psychology and merged it or moved it into cognitive neuropsychology and how it developed. So people identified Gage and Broca, and I think I've touched on both of these briefly. Broca was a psychologist and Gage was the person this happened to. They identified unusual behaviours and then linked it to brain damage. For example, Gage got an iron rod through his skull and his behaviour changed, and after he died they looked at where the damage occurred and they made links between the brain and that behaviour. The same with Broca. Broca had a patient who could only say the word tan. They waited till he died, they conducted a post-mortem and found that particular area of the brain was damaged, and that was called and that's now called Broca's area, and that's something you need to know for A2, and that's involved in the production of speech. So tan couldn't say the word tan, could only say the word tan, and they made the link between that area of the brain and that problem, so that cognitive process of thinking how to produce speech and being able to. Afterwards, brain scanning technology was developed, and we are going to look at Raynatel and Apple products. And Raynatel, we look at the brain structure of violent and non-violent murderers, and it's a very famous piece of research. It's probably one of the first pieces of research in the 80s that was used in psychology and used brain scanning techniques, so it's revolutionary and of course very interesting. And then we look at a more modern piece of research that happened a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember, there's a TV program called Super Brands, and they looked at Apple products and people's cognitive processes, the thought processes when they saw Apple products, and the effect that it had on the brain. And we're going to look at that more closely in class, but if you can just make some notes on those. Right, evaluations. Spec. Spec tells you the 4 evaluation points that you should include, and then P tells you how you should structure each one of those evaluation points individually. So the first evaluation point in Spec is supporting evidence, and the strength of the cognitive approach, as with any, remember we talked about this before, is that it has supporting evidence. And then your example is either Beardsley, where you talk about the prefrontal cortex being linked to the short-term memory, or Squires, and both where the hippocampus is linked to the long-term memory. You know more about that than me. This is your opportunity to gain those marks by showing off the example. And then this is a strength because if there is supporting evidence for the theory, then it increases the validity of that theory. We can be more confident in that theory. There are practical applications. So one of the most significant ones that we look at in psychopathology that you should be familiar with is rational emotive therapy. So it's in the book, have a read of it further on in psychopathology, and it's a way of treating depression. It's where we challenge irrational thought processes and replace those irrational thought processes with rational thought processes. Bear in mind what I said about irrational making you unhappy and rational making you happy. So a strength of the cognitive approach is that it has practical applications. For example, rational emotive therapy, and then you can give a summary of that I've just given about that, and then of course, so a strength of and as you know, a strength of having practical applications, once again, is that it suggests, especially effective practical applications, it suggests that the theory has high validity because it must be explaining what it claims to explain. We've also got cognitive stimulation. It's found that cognitive stimulation, having stimulating thought processes, improves your quality of life, particularly towards the end of your life, and reduces your chance of Alzheimer's. And there's a really interesting newspaper article on Intergenerational Learning Centre, which is where, I don't know if you've heard of this or come across it in videos, there's a couple of different ways. This one, it's very, very old, so the elderly in care. It's a daycare centre that's mixed with the elderly and also with very, very young children between the ages of 6 weeks and 5 years. And the idea is that it's to stimulate the elderly peoples cognitively, and that reduces their chances of contracting Alzheimer's and many other kind of brain-related, cognitive-related illnesses. And of course, again, strength of practical applications increases validity. Then you want to go on to evaluate the method, and you must be very careful about the way you word this. You wouldn't say that a strength is scientific, is that the way you want to word it, what you want to make it really clear is you want to make it clear that a strength of the cognitive approach is that it uses research methods which are highly scientific and objective. If you make the note of that one and not the extrapolation one, you've only got strengths, and you can occasionally be asked specifically for weaknesses. If it was if you said apologies, I've just completely lost my train of thought. I do apologise. So you can be asked specifically for a limitation, and then you would struggle with that. So you must say that a strength of the cognitive approach is that it has research methods which are scientifically objective. If you just said that if the focus instead was on research, the strength is the research methods are scientific and objective, you've missed out the cognitive part. You must link it back to, don't start to just talk about the research methods themselves. You want to make sure you keep it linked to the cognitive approach. The question is describe and evaluate the cognitive approach, and if you start talking just about the research methods without making it clear that the cognitive approach uses those research methods, you could lose marks. So evaluation is that they are scientific and objective. For example, they use brain scans and they use lab experiments, and you can talk about lots of different things. So they allow for a reduction in extraneous variables. We can be confident of cause and effect and therefore internal validity. And again, it's really important here, if you go on to talk about that, you must link it back to the theory, therefore increasing the validity of the research and therefore the validity of the theory. If you finished it with the research, you wouldn't get any marks no matter how good it was. You could also talk about the fact that it reduces bias. If it's a lab study, then it reduces bias, and if it's brain scans, it's the same thing. It reduces bias and biasness and subjectivity, because it's based on scientific methods, and this increases the validity of the research and therefore the theory which is based on that research. A weakness, and it's absolutely key, you must note this one down. I would pick this one over scientific objectiveness, but if you could mention more than one, that would be great, is extrapolation. So the idea of extrapolation, previously in the behaviourist approach, we've talked about extrapolation from animals to humans. Here, a weakness of the approach is that there's issues with extrapolation. For example, humans and computers, the cognitive approach compares humans and computers, and they are very different. For example, computers don't have free will, they don't display human emotion, and they don't make errors. So this is a weakness because the theory then can't effectively be applied to human behaviour, suggesting that it lacks validity. Okay. And then the final one, this one's a strength again. A strength is, and this is where you contrast with the alternative, a strength is that the cognitive approach is less deterministic than other approaches. Deterministic means, so a very good example of this would be the biological approach we're going to look at next week. If you have this low level of this neurotransmitter, if you have this brain damage, this will happen to you. You will develop this mental health need. You will not be able to learn effectively. So if this happens, this will happen. It's very deterministic. It doesn't allow for any choice or any free will. So the fact that you can do lots of different things to improve your health. So for example, the idea with the Alzheimer's, they suggest if you have this gene, you will develop Alzheimer's maybe, whereas it doesn't take into account the fact that you could ensure that you surround yourself with lots of people that stimulate you cognitively. You could go start a university degree later in life, whatever it might be. So a strength of the cognitive approach is that it's less deterministic. It doesn't have that clear kind of, if this happens, this will happen. For example, it acknowledges that therapy is effective and that people can change their irrational thought processes into rational thought processes. They can take control of and manage their cognitive processes. They can also develop cognitive processes. They can improve their problem solving, all of those things. So this is a strength because it considers both free will and determinism, because it's called that process of acknowledging that we have some control over our behaviour is soft determinism. And then this is a strength because it acknowledges both free will and determinism, therefore being a more effective and more valid explanation of human behaviour. In A2 you will talk a little bit more about determinism, and you will also talk about the idea that it allows us to take responsibility for our actions. If we accepted the determinist view, then we would take away any control people might have over their ability to manage, for example, their mental health needs. Now, I'm not suggesting that just by thinking about depression or OCD or whatever, you are able to remove that, stop that mental health, that mental illness from happening. However, by acknowledging that you have some power, you're not just blindly just taking medication and saying, well, I can't do anything about it. It's a mixture of controlling those deterministic values, so maybe biological determinism, that you might have a low level of neurotransmitter, but also seeking out exercise, trying to change the way that you think, the way that you approach things, with rational emotive therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy there. Okay, and that is the end of the cognitive approach.